Well, part of our 1994 season is devoted to showing you how to attract beneficial wildlife to your landscape or garden, primarily to help reduce insect population. And one such critter that should definitely be part of that landscape habitat is either the toad, frog, or salamander. And recently we visited with a zoology professor, Dr. Stanley Fox, from right here at OSU in Stillwater, about these Oklahoma amphibians.
Amphibians are vertebrates. They're animals that we have here in Oklahoma, quite a few of them, and they're mainly divided into two groups. The frogs and toads is one group, and the salamanders is the other group. And the thing that probably distinguishes amphibians from other similar looking animals is that they're kind of tied to water. Is that as young, as immatures, many of them have larval forms that have to live in water, and others, as adults, even live in water, or they have to come back to water to breed. These tadpoles here are bullfrog tadpoles. They're the largest frog we have in Oklahoma, the bullfrog, and the tadpole is real large. These tadpoles might take a year, maybe even 2 years to metamorphose from the tadpole stage to an adult bullfrog. But this is exactly the kind of habitat that bullfrogs like. The pros and cons, well, the bullfrog is used for food. It is the frog which is harvested for frog legs mostly. The nice thing about the bullfrog is the tadpole is large, so it can share a pond with fish. As long as it can escape its first few weeks of life, when it's real small, it will do well even if there are fish in that pond. The negative aspect of bullfrogs is that they'll eat almost anything that's small enough they can get in their mouth. They'll eat fish, they'll eat other frogs, they'll eat little small mammals, they'll even eat small birds, so they're very voracious predators. Well, I brought with me today a few examples of some Oklahoma amphibians, and I've got 2 examples of frogs and toads and 2 examples of salamanders. This first one, let me rinse him off a little, is the American toad. It is a toad, which really there isn't a real distinguishing difference between frogs and toads, but toads in general live in drier environments. And so this is the animal the amphibian that you'll find mostly in your yards. It's a big insect eater, and in fact it's attracted to lights because insects are attracted to lights at night. So you'll often find it in your yards eating maybe 100 insects in one night. The toad has a real bumpy skin. None of the amphibians have scales, unlike lizards and snakes. So it's got a bumpy skin, and these little bumps are warts, and this gland right here is the parotid gland. It's a poison gland. It's not poisonous against humans, but against potential predators. So once you handle a toad like this, you want to wash your hands because you might have some of those toxins on your skin. The other group of amphibians are the salamanders, and the big difference you can see there is that they're tailed. The frogs and toads have no tail, and salamanders have a tail. This is an amphibian like the toad, and so it doesn't have scales. It has a wet, slimy skin. And this animal, this is the smallmouth salamander. It's found pretty much statewide, but not in the far western counties nor in the panhandle. It's found in more moist situations than toads, and breeds in small ponds, usually ponds without fish, because the first life stage is a larva, like a tadpole, and are eaten by fish. It's a kind of a nondescript salamander. It's just kind of a dark color, which oftentimes has some mottling on it, but it is probably one of the most common salamanders in Oklahoma. Let's see, another salamander. There's a little more color to it, and it's also a little more active. This is the marbled salamander, and this salamander is found only in the southeastern counties, the southeastern corner of Oklahoma. In fact, most of the salamanders of Oklahoma are found in the eastern third of this state, and especially the southeastern corner. This is an interesting salamander because it's a fall breeder. Most amphibians breed in the spring. This one breeds in the fall. But it has a lot more color to it, and it shares a lot of the same characteristics: no scales, no claws on its toes, and it has a tail. So it's a salamander. It's not a lizard because it has a wet, moist skin and no scales. Okay, and I have in a bag here a very common but very small. This is an adult-sized cricket frog. This is found statewide, and it is found along the non-vegetated shores of ponds and creeks and rivers. It doesn't get any bigger than this. It also, like all the amphibians, is a carnivore. It eats little tiny insects and invertebrates. And another big difference between salamanders and frogs and toads is that frogs and toads sing in the spring to attract female, and salamanders are, for the most part, voiceless. So in the spring and summer, you often hear the song, the courtship song of this cricket frog, and it sounds like somebody knocking two rocks together with a tap, 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 tap noise. Will toads cause warts? That's a good question. It's a wives' tale. It's not true. You can handle toads, and they do have toxic secretions to keep predators from eating them, but they won't cause any warts or any problems like that. In fact, there's no poisonous amphibian, so you don't need to worry about like snake bite or poisonous snakes.
Well, as you can see, toads, frogs, and other amphibians are truly a gardener's best friend. As a matter of fact, some reports say they can eat as much as 3 times their body weight in insects. And also one study that I read told us that it's estimated 81% of their insect diet is actually made up of the pest insects. Pests like slugs, beetles, cutworms, flies, grasshoppers, sow-bugs, pill-bugs, earwigs, crickets, and even the dreaded cucumber beetle, which many other beneficial insects won't even, or beneficial critters won't even touch because of their bitter secretion that they put off. So amphibians really are nice to attract, and one way to attract them to the landscape or garden is really by the 3 basic areas again of food, water, and shelter. And let me show you some ways that you can do that. Now the food obvious is really easy because insects are just normally in our gardens and landscapes, especially if you have mulched areas like we have here. We have a lot of the ground insects like sow bugs and pill bugs. So really that's probably the easiest step. And also it's nice to remember that the amphibians are really not vegetarians. They prefer insects, so they're not going to harm your plants in your garden. Although I have heard some stories of the bullfrog maybe doing a little bit of damage, but really they are just strictly insect eaters. Now a water garden is very important, and that's really the component of water. And of course here at our studio gardens we have our water garden, the big areas where you saw the bullfrogs, and they're pretty easy to attract there it seems like, and can outcompete the other predators. But we're going to try to work on making that habitat a little bit more conducive to frogs and toads. But if you're not as fortunate as us in having a water garden, let me show you how to make a makeshift little water garden. And basically what we've done is dig a hole here to be able to fit in a container like this. Now there's all kinds of containers that you can use. This is just a tub that we've been able to purchase on sale at a pretty reasonable price. You can use whiskey barrels, or you can even use smaller versions like this one. The thing you need to make sure is that it will hold water, and a lot of the pots that are sold anymore have plugs to help hold water, or they'll have holes that you cut out so you can use it either way depending on what the purpose is. So we're going to submerge it here in this area that is a nice selected site, but we're going to create basically a small pond. And the first thing that we're going to do is set a couple of bricks in here, and we're going to leave a little bit of space between them. And then we're going to start setting some of our rocks in that are left over from one of our pathways. And I'm going to arrange it where there's actually space for frogs to be able to get under it. And then we'll just stack a few more to bring up some levels, again some areas for them to hide. And then we'll put one more on there, and that way it's easy for them to get in and out of this particular area. Now the next step is just to fill it full of water, and we're going to use some of our tap water here to start with. And just like on our other water, we'll want to make sure we dechlorinate that after we get it filled up. Well, after we have the appropriate water level, with our particular makeshift pond, we have room to stick in some plants. And we actually have one of our container plants that's in about a half-gallon pot that will just sit right in there. Now, of course, with this type of one, we're going to get a little bit of mud in it initially, and it may always be a lot muddier than our other garden because we don't have the fish in here, which, remember, can sometimes feed on the young tadpoles. But this is just a particular plant that's going to float along the top here and actually help shade it a little bit more and give the amphibians a little bit more protection. And that's actually the third component, if you'll remember, of what you need to use or actually get established a habitat, and that's shelter. Now they prefer moist, cool sites, and we've got it under a shade tree next to our water and our food source. And moisture, again, is real important. But that can also occur in the forms of other things that you put in the landscape. Now, to create a shelter type situation, you can do nothing more than just stack some rocks up. If you'll remember, over in another one of our habitats that we created earlier on, we just stacked up some rocks in among a snag, and that too will suffice in attracting the toads and frogs as far as protection. Now, the other thing that you can do, and I've heard stories about this particular one, is just to make an area where the frogs can kind of bury in and get protection somewhat. And all we're doing is just scraping back our mulch, cutting a little bit of the soil surface, and then we're going to take some compost and we're just going to scatter a little bit about, get rid of some of the woodier chips. And this actually is an area that they can come into and burrow in a little bit easier because it's not as compacted. And there's no telling how many times you've been out digging in your garden and you notice that the amphibians like to have areas that they can dig into. So that's what we're providing here. And then we're just taking a piece of old pressed lumber, and you can use plywood as well. And then we're going to come in and cover the back and bring the mulch across the top again to kind of disguise it. And we'll cover it, but we'll leave the opening here for the toads and frogs to climb down in. Cool, nice place for them to kind of rest and have some protection. Now, obviously, when you're creating some things like this, it may be a nice area to create for attracting snakes. So anytime you're going to be checking, always use a little bit of caution. Now, if you don't want to create something like this or the rocks, you can get a little bit more formal by putting in what is called the toad abodes. And you can actually purchase from various mail order and various specialty shops terracotta pots that are nothing more than just molded where they've cut a hole in it so they'll have an entrance there, and that way it stays moist. You water it down, get the moisture in there and cool. And one thing that I would encourage, though, we've scraped this back, the heavy mulch, which is a little bit harder for them to dig in, but I would encourage you to sprinkle some compost in there again on the bottom and not put that just right on top of the mulch. That way it's a little bit easier for it to hide from. And like many of you, we had some old terracotta pots that might have had a little bit of cracks in them, and we asked Alan to figure out a way to see if we could actually cut an entrance in without cutting them and breaking them apart. And he came up with a carbide-coated jigsaw blade that he put here on his scroll saw, and sure enough, you can see he was able to cut that piece out pretty nicely without cracking or breaking the pot. Now, the only difference is this one has a hole in the top, and one thing that you might want to do is just set a rock or something on it to kind of help hold the moisture in a little bit more and keep it from turning over. But you can do the same things. I've even heard stories for the kids to get involved, just to take a cottage cheese container, do the same thing, use a tray though to hold water off to the side. But of course these types of things would hold a little bit more moisture. So anything that can help in providing shelter is a nice thing. And so what we're going to do in addition, plant-wise, is put more ferns in here to kind of give it a more tropical type look, but it also is the right condition for the frogs and the ferns because I like moist shaded conditions, hostas, and we'll plant those around, and we'll also put in the mulch. We'll just rake it down on the side here where they can bury in that, and it'll be easier for us to slip this out if we choose to use it again. Now once we have the habitat established here, it's time to bring in the frogs and stuff. And how are you going to do that? Well, one thing I want to bring to your attention first of all is mosquitoes obviously like standing water, and until you can get the frogs in which would eat the mosquito larvae, you may have some mosquito problems. One thing that you can do is use what is called mosquito dunks. It's a form of Bacillus thuringiensis, variety Israeliensis. And remember, that's a little bit different. It's strictly for mosquito larvae. The other types of BT on the market are for other types of larvae. But what we would do is just take one of these dunks out, float them in the water, and that would get rid of the mosquito larvae until you get your frogs or toads situated in your makeshift pond. Now, as far as introducing them into the area, we found out through all the experts that really the best way is to just get some tadpoles, some of the smaller tadpoles, and introduce them in here. That way they're more likely to come back to this particular site, just like our bullfrogs are. The only problem are the bullfrogs are kind of harmful to some of the other ones. So we found that some of the fish supply areas will occasionally get tadpoles in for you. And remember, earlier on in the season is the most readily available time to go out and collect them in your particular area. And Dr. Fox also gives us some other pointers on collection of amphibians.
Okay, I think it's important if you want to have amphibians or any wildlife really in your own backyard, you should try to keep those which are native to that area. You should have those that are first native to Oklahoma and probably those that are found right around your area. It's not a good idea probably to bring animals, for sure exotic animals in, and not even a good idea to move animals around the state because there are adaptations that are local and genetic adaptations that would be scrambled and mixed up. So it's a pretty good idea to just find things near your house if you want to just kind of encourage them to live and take up residence in your yard.
Here we found a frog that we think is a tree frog, and the best analogy that we've been able to come up with is that it'd be like purchasing some beneficial insects, buying them in and trying to get them to stay right here in your landscape. Chances are they may go on to another one. So if we put the frog here in the water, chances are right off the bat he's going to jump away and hopefully he'll come back, but that's a big risk and a big question. So again, you can see why the larval stage or the tadpole stage is actually the best way to get them to come in or just naturally migrate in. And of course, like many of the different kinds of projects that we've been talking about, there's all kinds of good handy information that you can use in identifying and showing you how to do these kinds of things. And Dr. Fox showed us some of his favorite ones like the Peterson and Audubon guide. But of course our friends at the Non-Game Wildlife Department have one that's more adapted to just Oklahoma amphibians. And you can either pick one up in person for $5 or order it for $6 to cover postage from the Non-Game Wildlife Department. And again, it's a great book that has pictures on all amphibians. So a lot of fun, great ways to introduce those kids to gardening again and get them on the creepy crawlies at the same time, and you'll probably benefit from the, hopefully, lower insect populations in the long run too.